The hydrants didn't disappear overnight. But no one noticed until it was too late. And when the clubhouse stood silent under a sky that no longer reflected safety, the entire neighborhood realized something was terribly wrong. This story will reveal how one decision, made quietly behind closed doors, led to a moment no one could take back. The community of Oak Ridge Heights was known for its perfection. Clean streets, organized lawns, and a strict HOA that believed control meant order. Every detail was managed. Every rule was enforced. And every resident was expected to follow without question, but behind that polished image, changes had started happening. Small ones at first. Maintenance budgets were being optimized. Old systems were labeled unnecessary. And one by one, the fire hydrants across the neighborhood were quietly removed. The official reason sounded harmless: modern upgrades were coming. A new system would replace the old one. Something more efficient, more advanced. But weeks passed, and nothing new appeared. Some residents asked questions. Most didn't. Because in Oak Ridge, questioning the HOA felt like breaking an unspoken rule. Ethan noticed, though. He always did. Standing outside his home, he looked down the street where a hydrant once stood. Now, there was only empty space, and something about that silence didn't feel right. Ethan wasn't someone who ignored details. He believed small things often carried bigger meaning. And as days turned into weeks, the absence of hydrants began to feel less like an upgrade and more like a risk no one wanted to admit. He brought it up during the monthly HOA meeting. Calmly, respectfully. But the response he received was immediate and dismissive. Linda, the HOA president, smiled confidently as she explained everything away. "We're upgrading infrastructure. It's all under control." Her tone didn't invite further questions. It closed the conversation before it could even begin, but Ethan didn't feel reassured. He drove through the neighborhood later that evening, noticing every corner, every street. Not a single hydrant remained. Not one. It wasn't just a delay. It was complete removal, and yet, the clubhouse stood in the center of it all, large, expensive, and always active. A place the HOA proudly showed off. Ethan paused outside it, looking at the building under the fading sunlight. If something ever went wrong, he didn't finish the thought, because deep down, he already knew, and for the first time, Oak Ridge Heights didn't feel safe anymore. The following days carried a strange tension. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, in quiet conversations, in glances between neighbors, in the way people started noticing things they once ignored. Ethan wasn't alone anymore. A few residents had begun asking the same question: why remove something so essential without replacement? But every time the topic came up, the HOA responded the same way: brief, confident, final, everything is compliant. Those words echoed through emails and meetings like a shield against accountability. Still, the absence remained. Streets that once held safety now felt exposed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan stood near the clubhouse again. Lights glowed warmly inside. Laughter drifted out. It looked perfect. Untouchable, but perfection, he knew, could be misleading. He noticed something else that night. Near the clubhouse entrance, where a hydrant once stood, there was nothing but freshly paved ground. No sign of replacement. No visible plan, just emptiness, and in that emptiness, a quiet realization settled in: the system wasn't delayed, it had been removed. Without a backup, and if that was true, then the risk wasn't hypothetical anymore, it was real. The night everything changed didn't begin with chaos. It began with calm. The clubhouse was hosting an event, lights glowing, music playing softly, residents gathered inside enjoying another perfect evening. Ethan stood outside, watching from a distance. Something still didn't sit right with him, but there was nothing left to question. The answers had already been given. Then, slowly, something shifted, a faint signal, a change in the air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. But it was enough. Moments later, the calm began to break. People stepped outside, confused, looking around. Conversation stopped. Something was wrong. Ethan's eyes moved instantly to the spot where the hydrant used to be. Empty, still empty, and in that moment, everything he had been thinking, everything he had been warning about, became real in a way no one expected. The confidence of the HOA, the decisions made quietly, the explanations that once sounded certain, none of it mattered now, because what was missing was exactly what everyone suddenly needed. The following morning felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. Residents gathered near the clubhouse, their expressions changed. The place that once symbolized pride now stood as a reminder of something avoidable. Questions filled the air. Not quiet ones this time. Real ones. Ethan stood among them, not as someone proving a point, but as someone who had seen it coming. The HOA board arrived shortly after. Their confidence was gone. Replaced with something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Linda tried to speak, to explain, but the words didn't carry the same weight anymore, because now, everyone could see what had been missing, not just the hydrants, but the responsibility behind removing them. Records were requested. Decisions were reviewed. And slowly, the truth began to unfold. The upgrades had never been finalized. The removals had been rushed. The risk had been ignored, and now, the cost of that decision was visible to everyone. But the story wasn't over yet, because what came next wouldn't just change the HOA, it would redefine the entire community. The emergency meeting that followed was unlike any before. There were no formal smiles, no rehearsed statements. Just a room full of people demanding clarity. Documents were brought forward. Timelines examined. Decisions questioned. The pattern was clear. Shortcuts had been taken, warnings had been dismissed, and trust had been broken. Linda stood at the front, but for the first time, she didn't lead the room. The community did. Voices rose, not in anger, but in determination. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about change. Ethan listened quietly, watching something important unfold. For years, the HOA had controlled the narrative. Now, the residents were taking it back. A vote was called, not just about leadership, but about rebuilding systems, restoring safety, and ensuring something like this could never happen again. And as hands began to rise, one truth became undeniable. The power had shifted, not because it was taken, but because it was finally understood. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started that day. New leadership stepped in. Policies were rewritten. And most importantly, the missing systems were restored. With transparency this time, the neighborhood slowly found its balance again. But the memory remained, a reminder that even the smallest decisions can carry the biggest consequences. Ethan walked through Oak Ridge weeks later, noticing something familiar: hydrants standing once again where they belonged. Quiet, simple, but essential. He paused for a moment, looking at one near the clubhouse. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what had been learned. Because in the end, the story wasn't about loss, it was about realization, and how one overlooked detail changed everything. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you loved the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.